Another aspect of critical thinking, and I gave a couple of examples when I talked about informal fallacies that are really strictly speaking statistical fallacies, like poisoning the well. One climate change believer who believes in UFOs doesn't discredit the entire population of climate change believers. But of course, what's going on there isn't just a statistical fallacy, but it's something more about, well, poisoning the well, trying to take our negative associations with people who believe in UFOs and transfer them to a larger group of people. So it's an emotional move as much as it is a statistical move. But it is worth spending a few minutes thinking about the ways in which we use statistics or misuse statistics. I talked earlier about the importance of evidence-based decision making. And one of the key questions there is, where do you get your evidence and what do you count as evidence? And there are several ways in which I think statistics can lead us, or what looks like statistical methodology can lead us awry. So there's a pretty famous book called How to Lie with Statistics, which I highly recommend, which goes into much more detail here. So let me just give a couple of examples. Probably the most famous example, which we hear all the time, even for people who don't study statistics, is correlation doesn't equal causality. And that's certainly true. But there's, under that, I think, some complexities that are worth stopping and thinking about. Why is it a mistake to assume from a correlation, a statistical correlation, some other inference that it shows or proves some more substantive or causal connection? And there's a few reasons why that's dangerous to do that are just worth spending a couple of minutes on. One is, when you do a certain kind of statistical survey, especially when you have a very large number of variables in the survey, it's almost inevitable that you're going to find a strong association between two factors, a statistically significant relationship that pretty obviously doesn't mean anything. Except if you throw enough variables into a statistical machine, you'll find high correlations between some pairings or some relations in which there actually isn't any relationship at all, certainly nothing that you could call causal, but there might just be an artifact of the methodology that if you throw enough variables into the soup, suddenly A is going to have something to do with Z. So, left-handed people are 80% more likely to like Brussels sprouts. I'm pretty sure that there's no causal connection there, but it's possible that as you sort of throw out a set of variables, that relationship may be statistically significant, but it's simply an artifact of the methodology. It doesn't mean anything. And I don't think it means anything. Then there's other cases where there is a connection between A and B, but it's not clear which direction the causal arrow links. So you might have something like people who are significantly overweight don't do enough exercise. So there's pretty clearly some connection there, but it isn't entirely clear from the relationship whether it's the fact that they're overweight that means that they don't get enough exercise, or that because they don't get enough exercise, they have problems with their weight, or both in some kind of complex. So even when there is a connection, you don't always know which direction the causal arrow points to, or in fact, it could point in both directions, each kind of cyclically, like the chicken and egg, each sort of cyclically reinforces the other and makes it worse. So we might see a relationship that is a statistical relationship that might even be a causal relationship, but we don't know what the exact causal mechanism is. One of the issues that came up with smoking for so many years was it was not a secret early on that there was a statistical connection between smoking and certain kinds of lung cancer. But what the tobacco companies continually relied on was nobody could trace the actual causal mechanism that was connecting them. And so it could be like the left-handed people in Brussels sprouts, just an unfortunate accident. But if you think there is a connection, one might say, you still need to identify what the causal link is to actually know for sure whether that relationship is not just statistically significant, but also causally significant. And then there's another variety where there's a strong connection between two things. You hear this in my field all the time, that kids from homes with networked computers do much better in school. Now it might be that having networked computers at home does itself have a causal impact on helping them to better at schools. But it also could be that it isn't A and B, it's some third factor, C, that we're not talking about, like family income or level of affluence, that is actually causing both those two variables. So families that are more affluent are more likely to have network computers in their homes, and there's lots of research that shows that kids from more affluent families do better at school. So it could be that the relationship is not between A and B, it seems to be between A and B, but it's actually some third factor, C, which accounts for both A and B. So all of these are just variations of examples where a correlation or a relationship or a statistical association may not actually reveal an underlying causal mechanism, or actually may mislead us about what that causal mechanism actually is. So it's one thing to say correlation doesn't mean causation, which is true, but depending on the kind of correlation or kind of association, it may in fact impede our recognition of what the underlying causal mechanism is. One of the things that happens all the time in conversations is people who start, and in organizations, is people who start a statement with studies show or research shows. And this is becoming, I think, a really rampant part of our popular culture as local TV shows or talk radio or various media, or including social media, suddenly burst out this new study that shows that eating chocolate extends your lifespan, or eating chocolate shortens your lifespan. And the interest in these studies is understandable, because things like living a long time, having a good sex life, or whatever it is, are things that are important to people. And it's very nice to think that some magical ingredient or food or practice or gesture in one's life will lead to this really, really wonderful outcome. So studies that seem to show that are always going to attract a lot of attention. But anybody who's done research understands that the story is almost never that simple, that the causal link is almost never that direct. And that when you drill down a little bit into how research actually gets done, which these popular stories never actually talk about, you realize that in fact the story may not even, the research may not in fact even show the particular relationship that the headline claims. That like the game telephone, the second or third or fourth iteration of what the study shows may look very different from what the actual study, original study, actually did demonstrate, which almost certainly isn't as straightforward as eating chocolate extends your lifespan. And then there's other questions, you know, that again, the news versions or the popular versions or the thumbnail summary that gets thrown into a conversation or an organizational debate, well, research shows that, is again meant to sort of stop the discussion. Well, if research shows X, then we don't need to talk about it. Research has solved our problem for us. But there are further questions to ask. What was the methodology of the study? What was the sample size of the study? These are all familiar issues, and I'm not an expert in statistics, as probably has already become apparent. But you know, what was the sample size? Who was sponsoring or who was funding the research? Right? If there's a study that says smoking doesn't cause cancer, but it was being funded by the tobacco industry, I would want to know that, you know, in evaluating the authority or the credibility of the research study. But the thumbnail version, the summary, the sort of research shows offhand comment doesn't get into those kinds of details. But it seems that there's a certain kind of objectivity or, again, scientific authority to what studies show or what research shows. It's also true, and the vaccine as an example, is for any complicated problem, there are hundreds or thousands of studies. And they probably show a lot of different things, including sometimes evidence on both sides of particular disputes. And when there's evidence on both sides, this other danger that I alluded to a couple times, that people simply cherry pick those particular studies or that particular evidence, not necessarily that indicates the weight of evidence, but the particular studies that reinforce and support the claim or the agenda that they're trying to promote. It is true that research does show these things, or that studies have shown these things, but it isn't necessarily an adequate representation of the total sum. But the more there is, and the more ambiguous the research results are, the more people are likely to throw up their hands and say, well, nobody knows the answer. Even the researchers and scientists don't know the answer, so it's okay for me to cherry pick the evidence because the research is inconclusive. So why shouldn't I just go with whatever makes my life better or reinforces the other things that I want to believe or presuppose for other reasons? So all of these issues about selectivity, about a lack of really understanding the underlying methodologies, make that surface claim that research shows X really very dangerous, and almost always meaning either something more than it seems or something less than it seems, but all you get is the thumbnail sketch or the headline or the 30-second soundbite about what the research shows. And research is almost never that unambiguous in its claims. But that doesn't make for a good soundbite. That doesn't make for a good headline. So those are all ways in which we can be trying to do evidence-based decision making and trying to look at what research indicates, but that's far from a straightforward process. Part of what has to be said here is I'm talking in part about popular sort of reception or filtering or the telephone phenomenon that misrepresents research. When we work in institutions of higher education, presumably we know a lot more about issues of methodology. We know more about where something was published. We certainly know to ask about issues about who funded or who sponsored the research. So I think we have a much broader range of critical thinking tools to filter and assess and evaluate which studies are really worth paying attention to and which ones aren't. So I'm not saying research is useless or it's all, pick and choose what you'd like. We do have, I think, reliable, relatively objective methods for filtering and evaluating which research results, imperfect as they might be, because everything is incomplete and imperfect, are more likely to support more dependable or more credible policy decisions than other research. So I'm not saying that choices can't be made there, but I am saying that in that choice, it can sometimes be very tempting to find the evidence that helps to support what it is that we want to do anyway. We talk about research-based policy, but I have a colleague in Britain who likes to use the expression policy-based research. In other words, the policy comes first, and then you identify the research that aligns with that policy and helps you justify it to other people. And that's a very common thing. It doesn't mean the research isn't necessarily dependable or reliable, but it does mean that sometimes the policy agenda drives the selection and filtering of research, as opposed to the research in some totally objective way generating or driving the policy or decision making. And that's a temptation, not just for leaders, but for others as well, because we often do have something we're trying to do that for a variety of reasons we think is the right thing to do, and it can be very tempting to cherry pick or identify selectively the things that reinforce that purpose.